One of the recurring horrors of my childhood was that my mother hung her panties on the washing line. I was brought up in India, in a middle-class neighborhood in New Delhi, and my mother's panties caused a terrible scandal. I don't know if the other mothers wore panties at all underneath their saris, but if they did, they never, ever hung them where they could be seen. My mother's panties were like flags, proudly declaring her foreign origin to the world. They were proof that she belonged to that wicked breed of Western women. And everyone knew that Western women were licentious creatures. They showed their legs and divorced their husbands. And I was a daughter of one of them.
There was always a debate about whether it was desirable or undesirable if I turned up at the school for parents' meetings, and if so, what would I wear? And many instructions were given to me about how I should present myself, and each one of them, if I recall, was disastrous. And the only good effect of that was that if ever the teachers were about to criticize the children, after one look at the mother, they more or less decided that the poor children, with a mother like that, what could they expect?
My father, Jeet, was Indian, but my mother, Patricia, came from Australia. As a child, I hated the fair skin their union gave me. Everyone around me had dark skin, and my fair complexion was like a beacon conspicuously signaling my difference. My only saving grace was my Indian accent, which clearly established that even if I looked different, at least I sounded like everybody else. My father was always admiring my mother. Thanks to him, I grew up thinking that red hair and freckles were the ultimate sign of beauty. He was always buying her glamorous shoes, elegant high heels, which she couldn't possibly wear on the pitted pavements of Old Delhi.
I met your mother at a party, and I fell for her. I thought she was healthy, virtuous, intelligent, and also very beautiful. So I thought I could make up for my unhappy childhood if I could persuade her to marry me, and I might be able to leave the world a slightly happier place than I had found it.
My mother came from a good Australian family which boasted of lots of well-behaved teachers and priests and denied any convict ancestry whatsoever. I have always had the impression that her parents had not approved when my mother went off to the Australian National University in Canberra only to fall in love with and decide to marry an Indian PhD student.
When I announced it, I did it in a rather temperamental and I came home late and found them all waiting up. And they said, "And you were with that man again?" And I said, "Yes, and I'm going to marry him." So I can't remember what my father did, but Mum sort of burst into tears and flew into her room.
I think in the eyes of her parents, I was not masculine enough for her. I think that was more something, a deeper doubt in their minds than just a difference of nationality. And to me, that was something that Patricia found attractive, because I think there was more of a man about her, and I found that to be my best friend.
My parents were always escaping domesticity and disappearing together. It was a mystery to me why they never seemed to want to go to any respectable places. Even when we went up to Shimla, they would head straight for the narrow lanes of Lower Bazaar. I would trail along behind them as they set off on the hunt for yet another beauty, for their ongoing collection of calendars.
First we bought just one or two and took them home. And then we brought a few more. And then we thought, this is great, we bought more and more. The meanings I didn't even know. I mean, I couldn't tell Shiva from Vishnu. I didn't know one film star from another. And then Jeet had, it was developing very quickly. As soon as he'd seen the second calendar, he had a theory about, where they came from and what they were like and what they were telling.
My parents' calendar collection grew and grew, as did my embarrassment at their odd addiction to kitsch. I will never forget the agony of shame into which they plunged me as a child. I remember there was one my father had pinned to the bathroom door, which was considered so unspeakable that some of our friends were forbidden from going to the toilet in our house. Fortunately, there was one person in the family who could be relied upon to maintain all the rules of public decorum. My grandmother, Biji. Biji personified my claim to Indianness. She lived in Sangrur, about a day's train journey from Delhi. And Biji knew everything about everybody. Which boy had failed at school, which man was eyeing his sister-in-law, and whose aunt had been caught milking someone else's cow. It was Biji, my fierce matriarchal grandmother, who was the first to greet my mother when she arrived in India.
I was completely unprepared for coming to India, let alone for coming to Sangrur. And I'd only read, I think, 2 books ever about India. So when I arrived here, I was utterly dazzled and completely dazed. Bibiji was there waiting, and a whole party and posse of people as we came back in rickshaws from the station. And she had some water and oil, which she poured on the doorstep before we'd stepped in. And then I was herded into this downstairs room where everyone came for that thing of looking at the new bride's face. Then Bibiji produced what she had for me. And, in a sort of ceremonial way, she picked up these bangles and she tried to put them on this girl's hand. And my hand was so huge that there was no way the bangles could do anything but go over my fingers. And then finally, Bibiji, with her usual sort of daring, she ripped actually this bangle, she ripped it off her own arm and put it on me, so that it was all right.
I have never seen my mother's hand without that bangle. Maybe it was too hard after all that to take it off. Maybe it meant too much. For me, that bangle was one of the few things that linked my mother to all the other Indian mothers, each of whose bangles clinked with an individual music. My mother was always telling us grandma and grandpa stories, where they were forever playing tennis or swimming or bowling under sunny Australian skies. Those stories were all that kept our distant Australian grandparents alive for us. I knew Grandma loved us because she sent us parcels of goodies like Tang and Vegemite, but she never came to visit us in India.
Grandma never came here. She never showed any interest in visiting me. She didn't really want to see me in circumstances that she didn't feel comfortable with. So either she didn't think she'd brought me up in order that I should land up in a place like she imagined this would be, that disaster zone of war and poverty and deprivation and overproduction of children. I mean, I wrote copious letters. I used to write every week for years and years and years. But the details of this letter, or, photographs of where we were, or descriptions of anything, or even producing occasionally my children back in Canberra, Australia, nothing convinced her it was normal and manageable. and that other mothers were cruising around to visit their children in India and no harm befell them.
We could rarely afford to go to Australia, and for me it was just a fantasy conjured up when my mother made cream cakes or pavlovas. Australia only became real to me the day I came home from school to find my mother in bed and weeping. I had never seen her cry before. Grandma had sent news that Grandpa had died.
She sent a telegram, and then we went and called her up, and she said she was managing okay. She's a real stoic, and there were a lot of people to help her, and she'd let us know when the ceremony was coming, but there was really no need to uproot ourselves. Just like that.
But don't you think, wouldn't you rather have gone?
Probably.
There were 3 of us children. I was the eldest, my brother Prem was next, and my sister Simran was the baby. PG would visit us often, bringing us jars of homemade pickles and some truly ugly frocks. When she was in a good mood, BG would tell us stories about her school days. She was very proud of having been a brilliant student, and she could remember and recite the exact amount of each scholarship she had ever won. She never let us forget what it meant in those days for a small town girl like her to get an education in the big city of Lahore and finally qualify as a teacher.
ऐसे भगवान ने हमारी मदद की तो जब वो स्कॉलरशिप खत्म हुआ तो ये लग गया पढ़ाई के वक्त जब हमारा भगवान जानता है रिजल्ट भी नहीं निकला था तभी हमें कह दिया गया कि ये स्कूल खाली हैं सरकारी स्कूल हैं रावलपिंडी का है जेलम का है और सियालकोट का है और लड़कियों के स्कूल.
There was only one part of her story that BG had never told us. Instead, it was my mother who told me that at the age of 19, BG had eloped with my grandfather, a handsome poet 10 years her senior. In the ensuing scandal, BG's family disowned her, and her mother never spoke to her again. My grandfather Papaji was a Sikh, and like a proper Sikh patriarch, he had a fabulous beard and a big white turban which hid his pink bald head.
I think Papaji was the nearest person to a genius I've ever met. And he was absolutely extraordinary in many, many ways. He was brilliant and creative. But his real interest, I suppose, was in spiritualism or the spiritual life, which came through Sufism and the Bhakti tradition. And then during the 60s or 70s, he became a very minor guru on American campuses with a following of what I used to describe as floozies and woozies.
I loved the parade of disciples through the house, especially the American girls who all seemed to have names like Honey and Candy. They would bring us boxes of chocolate and moon over my grandfather. He would do yoga with them and get them to transcribe his poetry. It was kind of grand to have a guru as a grandfather.
The problem was he was a very demanding and egotistical man with particularly very fussy about his food. Living with him was a very, quite a tense affair. The more attention he demanded and the more he got, the more his son felt jealous and neglected. And in between the two of them, you know, I used to feel sometimes like I was being torn asunder because no sooner had one sort of demanded something or thrown a fit about something, the other would do the same and wonder what the first was making such a fuss about.
According to BG, all men were bastards, and she put her husband at the top of the list. Her constant denigration of Papaji never lost its vociferous edge, even though they had been divorced since 1950.
I think people take to mixed marriages differently. My parents had a mixed marriage in terms of background and caste, and but they didn't make a good job of it. They were very unhappy. It was a love marriage of the 1930s, and I think it was a disaster for both of them. My father thought it was an obstacle to his spiritual development. My mother maintained always that it was an obstacle to her human development.
When Biji was depressed, she would tell us what we called the Atrocity Stories. They were detailed descriptions of how my grandfather had mistreated her. I always thought the cruelest story was about how he locked up all the books in a cupboard so she couldn't read. There were books everywhere in our house. They were covered in dust, and in the summer, pigeons would build nests in the top shelves. My mother was always working on her PhD, which seemed to take forever to complete, while my father was the archetypal professor with a constant stream of devoted students at his feet. This was the peaceful heart of my home. My mother scribbling all day and my father annotating his manuscripts all night. It was this peace which was shattered when Papaji died and the troubles of 1984 began. I was 16 years old when both my parents went to Chandigarh to look after Papaji. I had just discovered boys, and I was having a very exciting time when Biji arrived from Sangrur to look after us. Biji was infuriated by my boyfriends and accused me of bringing shame to the family name. While we quarreled, a serious political crisis was brewing in the Punjab, where my parents were struggling to cope with my grandfather's illness.
I suppose what happened in his last days is he probably was suffering from Alzheimer's. I don't think we knew enough about Alzheimer's to realize what might be going on. And in that condition, he sort of, somehow went over the deep end and, needed to be hospitalized. The doctors were keeping him there, and he was going from becoming one sort of patient in the medical ward to them realizing that actually, I suppose he was a psychiatric case, for which probably there couldn't be much done. And in the course of this, it was very hard to realize that this was a medical condition or to separate it from the fact that he was traveling to and fro in his life and reliving his life. And that's when I realized that he was speaking very lovingly of BBG and he wanted to be there. So I wrote a letter to her saying that he's asking after you often, very often, and he's living back in those times, and we think he's dying, we know he's dying. And she sent back a letter. It was about 8 or 10 pages long, and it was a furious and vengeful catalogue of everything that man had ever done to her. And she said that, whatever fate he was suffering now was the fate he deserved, and that was just as it should be after the way he'd treated her. And what I thought then, how could anyone at a deathbed be so vengeful? But she could be.
Biji and Papaji had lived in Lahore for 14 years, and my father was brought up there. Then in 1947, their world fell apart. India had declared its independence from the British and was divided into two nations, India and Pakistan. As Sikhs, my father's family found themselves fleeing Lahore, which had become a Pakistani city, overnight. They joined millions of other Hindus and Sikhs headed for India, while millions of Muslims moved in the opposite direction. My father was 12 years old at the time, but he never told me what he saw during partition. It was BG who told me about the blood on the tracks from the trains in which every man, woman, and child had been slaughtered. And BG also told me that she was 7 months pregnant with a child who died during the long train journey. BG was very sick when the family finally reached the refugee camp. She said that Papaji would have left her there to die if the children had not refused to leave without her. When she recovered, it was she who left Papaji. 35 years later, as Papaji lay dying, BG still refused to forgive him. She left it to my mother, her dutiful daughter-in-law, to nurse Papaji as he descended further and further into madness.
He was reenacting Lahore in 1947 in the ward of the hospital, running up and down, scampering and speaking about it. It was a very peculiar sensation. And of course, he had senile dementia. But he did it he was demented in a very stylish and completely awesome way.
Papaji had dedicated his whole life to the study and creation of Punjabi history and culture. Now, as he went mad, it seemed as if the whole state of Punjab was mirroring his insanity. There were bomb blasts in cinema halls, and policemen were gunned down in open marketplaces. Sikh extremists were demanding a separate Sikh state of Khalistan, and the government of India was responding with escalating armed repression. Every evening found the city of Chandigarh still and curfew-bound.
Maybe it was this talk of curfew that set him off. He kept on saying he wanted to go home to 310. And we said, you can't go home, there's curfew. And he said he had to go home. We said, you can't go home, there's curfew. And he then began to transport himself back into Lahore in 1947, or the times in Lahore where there'd been curfew. This was the prelude to the partition and the riots. And with me there, he enacted various scenes and made a whole lot of comments, which were not only traveling back to Lahore in 1947, but in a terribly prophetic way, they took us forward to Delhi in 1984. He'd say to me, you can't wear this gold. He said, take it off. You've got to hide it. He'd say, we must find a good place to go to. You must go to a good Sikh house. And then there was another sequence where we would look out the window together, and we'd see the city burning. Everything he said was going to happen, he was like a prophet.
My father was born in 1899 and died in 1984, and I saw in the way he used to talk, in his manic, depressive way, in his last days, the whole century and all the places where he had lived and he had been in, all became transparent for me in a way in which they never did in all his writing, and he did write a lot.
I truly believe that, like a proper yogi, he controlled his own death. I watched him dying, and I think he took a deep breath and said, that's enough. And he died like that.
Back in Delhi, BG and I were still fighting when the news arrived that Papaji had died. Biji looked triumphant. She had outlived the greatest bastard of them all. She put us 3 grandchildren on a train to Chandigarh while she took a train back to her home in Sangrur. She had no intention whatsoever of attending the funeral.
We arranged for a reading of the Guru Granth Sahib, and the idea is that it's ceremonially opened and it's read continuously over a period of 11 or 13 days. And at the close of this, you have the closing funeral ceremony, which is meant to be a sort of, in this case, a happy event, because their death was the death of an old man who had children and grandchildren, who lived a great life, we think. And then all of a sudden, everything went completely out of hand.
On the 10th day of the prayers for my grandfather's funeral, the government of India declared a statewide curfew. No one was allowed to leave their homes, and shoot-at-sight orders were issued throughout the Punjab. The same night, the Indian government launched Operation Blue Star, a military action designed to flush out suspected terrorists from their hideout in the Golden Temple in Amritsar. The Golden Temple is the holiest of Sikh shrines, and those who were in it were prepared to fight to the bitter end. The battle raged for 3 days.
We didn't know what to do because we were under complete curfew. Somehow everyone got the idea that this particular ceremony had to be gone through and completed as though it were the last thing on earth that anyone did. So with, actually at some risk, people sneaked round the back and over fences and somehow came in the home, and the reading kept on going.
On the last day of the prayers for my grandfather's funeral, the last gun in the Golden Temple fell silent.
But when they finished the whole ceremony, they turned on the radio and they heard that the action in the Golden Temple had been completed, and the Golden Temple had been raided or recovered, or whatever you might say. And suddenly everybody burst into tears, and it was like a sense of terrible tragedy and violation, and I would even say impending doom.
At the end of the funeral ceremony, there was a ritual of tying a turban on the chief mourner's head. The turban itself was loaded with significance. Just a few years after partition, my father had left India to go to study in England. He was only halfway there when he asked the barber on board the ship to cut off the long, uncut hair, which is symbolic of the Sikh faith. The father I had grown up with had short hair, a neat goatee, and was a liberal atheist. But at my grandfather's funeral, as I watched the turban being wound around my father's head, I was overwhelmed by the solemn realization that he was never going to take it off. My father became a Sikh again. When we got back to Delhi, we found that my father had chosen the worst time to become a Sikh. Most of the people around us believed that Operation Blue Star was a legitimate action to destroy a dangerous terrorist base. There was no sympathy for Sikhs who felt that the Golden Temple had been desecrated.
When I got back to Delhi, I couldn't believe that people in Delhi didn't understand the hurt that Punjabis and Sikhs had suffered, right or wrong, but that they were feeling hurt and dishonored was absolutely clear. And one knew at that moment, though it had nothing really to do with the actual political events in a necessary way. You knew at that moment that wasn't the end of the story.
My father had always loved the old city of Delhi, and he knew it like the back of his hand. He was always taking us to wonderful places, to markets and graveyards, to temples and mosques. But now, with a turban on his head, my father was marked as a Sikh, and there were some places where he could no longer go. I was with him, and I saw the tears in his eyes the day he was refused entry to a place of pilgrimage where he had been many times before.
People's reactions to you just change. You become socially a different person. You're not a different person, of course you're not. But you're socially different. And you're marked in a particular sense within a politics of situation. People who'd been loyal become traitors. Or people who'd been normal become marked. Or people who'd been like us become different.
My father began to write his next book on the 5 symbols of Sikhism, and he would practice his theories on us. He told us that Sikhs wore long, uncut hair and a turban to distinguish themselves from Hindus, and Sikhs wore a kacha, an underwear, as a symbol that they were not circumcised like the Muslims. They wore a kara, a steel bangle, something even a poor person could afford as membership to a deeply egalitarian faith. And my father told me that Sikhs carried a kirpan, a dagger, as a symbol of their independence. I was completely swept away by my father's passion. I was seduced by the grandeur and the beauty of his ideas. I wore a kara, and I have never cut my hair again.
If Jeet took a new identity, that's his business, and I'll stick with him. But he also thrusted on his children. And I think that I suppose, he hadn't thought of the consequences of doing that because one hadn't necessarily expected, although one had this inner feeling that things were going to take the turn they did.
Towards the end of 1984, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, the Indian Prime Minister who had ordered the attack on the Golden Temple, was assassinated. She was gunned down by her Sikh bodyguards. Sikh honor was avenged, and all hell was let loose. When we woke up the next morning, the city was deathly silent. Slowly the news filtered in. Angry mobs were pulling Sikhs out of their homes and burning them alive. My brother and I went up to the roof of the tallest house in the neighborhood, and we watched our city burn. It was all just as my grandfather had predicted in his last manic days. We could just see the rioting mobs getting closer, and I knew that if they reached us, they would kill my father, and then they would kill my brother, who was all of 12 years old.
It was all a big exciting adventure, really. It's great. You sit up on the rooftops and watch the city burn. Sensational. It's like big fireworks display. You see, it's everything. I mean, to a young boy, everything that's happening becomes exciting. Oh, look, there's a man burning down the taxi stand. Oh, look, isn't that exciting?
I was just wondering what we were to do next when one of the lecturers in history in St. Stephen's came to our flat and said, look, there's looting and burning of Sikh shops, and they're being burnt alive in pouring kerosene on them and holding them down, and you must come with us immediately. I said, well, at least give me time to ask my wife. And what did she do? She just collected, I suppose, the passports and the children, and our little one just collected her ballet shoes, I think.
We were quickly sort of packed up and trotted down the lane behind the house. We went out the back gate and down the lane, which is all very quiet because there was a curfew on, and past the little wiggly cow gate and across the field, and went to somebody's house where I'd never been before.
My father left the house without his turban, so no one would know that he was a Sikh. With his unmanning, I understood for the first time what partition and 1947 must have meant to him. We were lucky, really. Some brave friends hid us in their homes, and no mobs found us. My brother and my father were safe, and when we returned to our house, it was still standing. But it never looked the same again.
I was talking to a friend at school, and we discussed the whole riots thing, and I could not get across to her that there was something wrong with killing people who had done nothing, for just being who they were or for being born in a certain way. And I gave up. I realized there's no, I burst into tears myself, and she said, but I don't mean you. And I said, but yes, you do. Like, you mean me and everybody else like me. And she goes, but I don't mean personally you. And nobody's going to ask me about me personally before they burn my house down.
In 1966, my father had left Australia and come back to an idea of India. He had introduced his wife to it, and he had inspired his children with it. But now his flag lay blood-splattered. I think he went a little mad. He would rage about the state of the nation or fly into an irreconcilable fury simply because my mother was late coming home from work.
I think that he felt the events of 1984 were a tremendous betrayal, because then he learned he wasn't an Indian, he was a Sikh. And Sikhs are not Indian, and their hearts are not in the right place. And that was an awful moment for me, because I'd followed a man who, even if I didn't quite understand the wellsprings of it, who'd come back to his own country for certain reasons, who had a project that he thought he had a project, personal, intellectual, professional. And at some sudden point, his project vanished. And then I thought, well, what in the hell am I doing here? Here I am, all high and dry, and I'm here because of him, and he's got no reason to be here. He feels that this is not his country, and it's not a country for his children either. So where does that leave me? What am I doing here?
A few months after the riots, bombs were planted by Sikh terrorists all across the city of Delhi. They were hidden in transistor radios and left in buses headed for all the areas from which the rioting mobs had come. Poor people picked up the radios, and when they turned them on, they were blown away. As the violence continued, my brother Prem began to do badly at school. My father was away, and my mother took an unusually radical step.
I just walked straight out of the headmaster's office, and I rang up my mum and said, will you keep him for 2 years and put him in school there? She sounded a bit stunned, but she said, yes, all right, And I went to my bank, and I found I had enough money for a one-way ticket, and I bought him a one-way ticket and gave him a pat on the back, and I sent him off to Australia, which was about the most cruel and ruthless thing I've ever done in my life, in a way. And particularly because I didn't even tell his father.
I mean, 15 years have transpired since then. A lot of water under that bridge. But I mean, that certainly had an effect on me in terms of my, the depth of my involvement or my attraction to India. And quite often people have asked me here, especially people of an Indian background, you know, how come you don't have as much affection for India as you should, considering you grew up there? And my answer is, of course, it's very hard to love a country that's trying to kill you.
When my brother left India, the country was still in a state of shock. He never saw the beginnings of recovery. My mother and I worked in refugee camps set up after the riots. We helped to serve food and made sanitary napkins and recorded the testimony of 5-year-old children who had seen the faces of their father's killers. The work was terribly confronting, but it was also very comforting. There was no time to cry. I wanted the camps to go on and on so that I could assuage the terrible guilt of having survived. But eventually the camps were disbanded. People went home to rebuild their lives. And I learned a very important thing, that even the most terrible wounds can begin to heal.
We were really replaying what had happened in June of 1947, but there was a difference, and the difference was that Patricia and I decided that we would stay, whatever the circumstances. I was not willing to go through that replay beyond the first act, and the children would have to make up their own minds when they grew up.
Australia had always been a faraway world to us. But after 1984, it became the promised land. Only a few years after my brother left India, my mother sent my sister to study in Australia. As if to mark a new beginning, my sister changed her name from the Sikh name of Simran to the Greek name of Zoe. She was only 14 years old when she left.
Yeah, I think he was slightly misguided. I don't think there are any more opportunities here. Or I would not have had any more opportunities here than I would have there. In fact, I would probably have had far more opportunities to sort of do things that would be fulfilling to me over there than I would have here. I think that would partly be because I grew up there and it was home and comfortable, and I knew my way around, and I'd established, you know, who I was in those surroundings from an early age.
After 1984, a change in Indian visa regulations meant that it was no longer possible for my mother to work in India on an Australian passport. After 20 years of preserving her Australian nationality, my mother took Indian citizenship.
We'd just been through such a trauma and felt like fleeing. And actually what I did was do the opposite, you know. That's sort of very peculiar. But whatever it is, then I thought, well, we'd go ahead with it. And I am here, and I've been here all these years, and I've hardly ever been back to Australia. What's all this sentimental thing about? But it probably it did hurt quite a lot. And how I knew that it hurt was that I went to a feminist camp in Rishikesh, where the girls got to know each other by playing these encounter games, and we had to tell each other secrets of things that hurt or didn't hurt. And suddenly I couldn't express myself on the citizenship issue. You know, I was really sort of, you know, crying. It was funny, I was laughing at myself, saying, you silly old sentimental thing. I mean, you're sort of, and then I thought, well, you know, perhaps one's crying for some other reason, but this is just the, you know, this is just what's brought it up. But I did realize that I'd done something violent.
To yourself, by not keeping.
Yeah.
In 1994, I too left India to study in Australia. When I got there, I found I was no longer a fair-skinned girl in a dark country. I looked like everybody else. Then I would open my mouth and my accent would cast me as a stranger. It made me think a lot about my mother and her move to India. 2 years later, I returned to visit my parents in India, and I found myself looking at my mother with completely different eyes. I had always seen her as an outsider, but now I was struck by how at home she was in India.
I really have no idea if I looked in a mirror what I'd see, because quite often I walk around the places of Delhi where there are lots of foreigners, especially young women. So now here I am, I'm middle-aged, but I look at these young women and I think, you know, they're not properly dressed. Or sometimes I look at them and I think, oh gosh, what a beautiful blonde that is, and what lovely hair, and what lovely complexions, and so on. And I find myself looking at them as though they were a different race, you know? And it's very curious to me to think that if I came back and took a look in the mirror, I'd look like I ought to be their mother, instead of whose mother I am, which is...
When I decided to marry my Indian boyfriend, I think I surprised both my parents by insisting on a traditional Sikh ceremony. Then my mother surprised me by organizing everything perfectly. She arranged the flowers and bought brocade covers for the holy book. The only thing she didn't and wouldn't do was to weep in true Punjabi abandon when the ceremony was completed. My father is Indian, and so is my mother.
I think this business of finding out who you are, if you go by the last 35 years that I've lived with Jeet, in fact, even if you like you know, my own attitude to myself, you can feel that it's a lifetime's quest. So there's never any point at which you can probably just put a full stop and say, now, that particular thing is decided. It's always being played out in very complex ways, together and in separation.
My father has now retired from the university, and my mother is writing a book on the calendars they began collecting when they first arrived in India.
When I was going to marry Jeet, I did run off to one of his very good friends called Bill Roth. And I said to Bill, you know, this man's proposed to me. What do you think? I mean, he is a bit of a, you know, quite a kettle of fish. And Bill said, well, he said, I can promise you one thing. He said, life with him, and maybe he thought life in India, will never be, it'll never be easy. I can promise you that. And he said, but also, it'll never be dull. And sometimes I think, well, you know, how true he was.
Most of the time, I live in Australia, but I keep going back to India. to work, to film, to dream, to remember. It is not always easy to move between two such different places, but it is never dull. And I know I owe this freedom to my mother and to the much harder choices she had to make.